The heavy cast-iron treadle of the Singer sewing machine hummed beneath the arch of my work boot, a steady, rhythmic metal cadence that rattled the wooden floorboards of the sub-basement workshop beneath the Philadelphia County morgue. Clack clack click. I guided a long strip of unbleached white cotton beneath the rising and falling steel needle, my fingers moving with the precise, practiced muscle memory of a man who spent his life measuring the dead down to the final centimeter. My name is Carter. Tell me. Have you ever spent a suffocating, pitch-black midnight locked deep inside a damp basement workshop where the air smells perpetually of heavy starch, disinfectant soap, and cold formaldehyde? Most people think death arrives with a flash of light, screaming sirens, and the frantic chaos of emergency rooms or police cordons out on the lit streets of Philadelphia. They imagine tidy funeral homes with soft carpets and quiet organ music where grieving families gather to say a peaceful goodbye. They do not know what it is like down here in the limestone sublevels, where the windows are painted black against the city smog and the only illumination comes from a single, hooded yellow bulb hanging directly over a heavy cutting table. They do not know about the heavy, suffocating silence that fills the room between the rhythmic, metallic clatter of an iron pedal driving a needle through thick linen. Have you ever asked yourself why a young man with steady hands and a quiet disposition would willingly spend his nights hunched over a vintage sewing machine, stitching burial garments for strangers who checked out of the world upstairs? Let me tell you. It is not because of the modest municipal wages, which barely cover a rented room above a corner bakery and a weekly pack of cheap cigarettes. It is because when you are trying to outrun the echoes of your own failed life and a family that forgot your face long ago, the hypnotic, mindless precision of cutting and hemming white cotton feels like the only place where you can actually make something whole. At least, it does until the midnight shift rolls past 2 in the morning and a fresh intake slider rattles down the incline from the autopsy suite above. Tonight was supposed to be a routine double order. An endless labyrinth of wooden storage shelves, cardboard pattern boxes, and towering bolts of white linen filled the damp room on every side, casting long, distorted shadows across the stone walls. My job was entirely manual, meticulous, and agonizingly slow. Review the intake ledger sent down by the county coroner, noting the exact height, weight, and shoulder measurements of each new arrival. Unroll the heavy cotton bolts across the long oak cutting table, measuring out standard burial shrouds with a wooden yardstick and marking the fabric with a piece of blue tailor's chalk. Guide the material through the cast-iron Singer, running double-stitched seams along the edges to ensure the garment would hold firm during transfer to the municipal cemetery at dawn. My fingers were permanently calloused along the tips from gripping fine needles and heavy canvas, the skin stained slightly blue from the chalk dust as I planted my boot back onto the iron treadle and reached for a fresh bolt of white cloth. The steam pipes hissed loudly inside the masonry overhead, sending long, shivering clanks through the walls, while the yellow bulb cast a sickly amber glow over the bobbins and spools. I pressed my foot down, felt the internal flywheel engage with a solid thunk, and listened to the distant, muffled rumble of traffic passing along Broad Street 3 floors above my head. And then, right through the steady, mechanical clatter of the sewing machine, the heavy metal door of the intake chute gave a slow, metallic scrape. The heavy iron door of the intake chute scraped against the stone floor with a dry, metallic screech, followed by the dull, echoing clank of a stainless steel gurney locking into position at the bottom of the gravity-fed lift. I didn't lift my foot from the iron treadle immediately. I kept the needle buried deep inside a fold of white cotton, my right hand holding the fabric taut against the throat plate while the internal flywheel spun down with a long, dying whir. Have you ever experienced that sudden, bone-chilling drop in temperature when an intake arrives from the autopsy suite above without a single word of warning from the orderlies, knowing full well that you are locked down in a restricted basement where nobody is supposed to walk after midnight? People always talk about morgues as places of clinical finality, quiet, sterile rooms where doctors complete their paperwork and bodies are catalogued with respectful detachment before being handed over to grieving families. They imagine orderly hallways, bright fluorescent lights, and the reassuring presence of medical staff managing the transition from life to peace. They do not know the unnatural, suffocating dread of working in a basement sublevel where footsteps overhead sound muffled and distant, leaving you entirely alone with the acoustic anomalies of a building built on top of a century's worth of unclaimed sorrows. They do not know what it feels like when your heart hammers against your ribs because you can hear the heavy rubber wheels of a stretcher rolling across the concrete floor upstairs, even though the shift log explicitly stated no more arrivals were scheduled until dawn. I slowly lifted my foot off the iron pedal, pushed my wooden stool back with a soft scrape, and stood up from the cutting table, my joints cracking in the heavy, humid air of the room. The hallway outside the workshop was empty. No night shift orderly coming down to drop off paperwork or share a cup of black coffee from the staff room. Only a fresh, white-bordered intake card resting squarely on top of the stainless steel drop table, held down by a heavy iron paperweight shaped like a skull. Think about how much confidence we place in our physical barriers and institutional routines, believing that as long as we keep ourselves locked inside a building guarded by municipal codes, the tragedies of the city upstairs cannot invade our private workspaces. We lock our basement doors, we punch our time cards, and we tell ourselves that the dead brought down the elevator shaft are just medical specimens, cases to be measured, stitched, and forgotten by morning. We believe that time and linen are enough to wrap up human suffering into neat, sanitary packages that can be hauled away by cemetery trucks before the sun comes up. Then an unscheduled intake card lands on your table without a signature to explain who pushed the gurney down, and you realize your workshop is just a waiting room for things that refuse to stay still. I walked slowly across the concrete floor, my boots echoing off the damp stone walls, and picked up the intake card under the sickly amber glow of the hanging work lamp. The cardboard was stiff and clean, smelling sharply of fresh ink and chemical antiseptic. The typewritten header on the card read simply, County Intake, Unclaimed Male, EST age 30s, because of death, undetermined trauma. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would remain steady if you walked over to an intake gurney and saw your own home address scrawled across the coroner's tag in grease pencil? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. I set the card down, turned back toward the vintage Singer machine, and pulled a fresh 20-yard bolt of heavy white cotton across the oak cutting table, preparing to measure out the longest shroud of the night. The 20-yard bolt of unbleached cotton unrolled across the long oak cutting table with a heavy, dry whisper, the stiff fabric catching the air and filling the cramped sub-basement workshop with the sharp scent of milled starch and raw fiber. I reached for my wooden yardstick, its edges worn smooth by years of sliding against rough textiles, and laid it flat across the white cloth, pressing my thumb firmly against the zero mark near the edge of the workbench. Have you ever experienced that peculiar, hyper-focused numbness that settles over your nervous system when you are about to measure fabric for a body that arrived without a name, knowing that you are completely alone down in the limestone foundations of the city? People always talk about tailoring as a craft of elegance and precision, a matter of fine suits, flattering cuts, and careful adjustments made for living clients who stand before a mirror in well-lit fitting rooms. They imagine tailors as artists working with silk and wool, smiling and chatting while they pin hems and chalk lapels for weddings, banquets, and high society galas upstairs. They do not know the agonizing, mechanical reality of working in a subterranean morgue workshop where every measurement is governed by strict municipal burial codes and the cold dimensions of a zinc-lined transit box. They do not know what it feels like when your breath catches in your throat because the yardstick in your hand feels less like a tool of measurement and more like a divider separating the living world from the cold storage vaults down the hall. I picked up the blue tailor's chalk, my fingers gripping the dusty square of pigment as I measured out 6 feet and 2 inches along the stark white linen. Scratch, scratch. The chalk left a clear, powdery blue line across the coarse fibers, marking the exact boundary where my shears would cut the shroud free from the bolt. According to the intake card sitting under the skull paperweight, this new arrival required a standard adult wrap, wide across the shoulders, deep at the chest, and tapered toward the feet so the municipal drivers could slide the package into a cedar-lined box before dawn. My movements were automatic, driven by thousands of hours of repetition in the dim amber glare of the hanging work lamp. Unroll. Measure. Mark. Cut. Think about how much trust we place in simple tools and straight lines, believing that as long as we measure our materials accurately and follow the instructions in the ledger, we can keep the chaos of death neatly contained within predictable boundaries. We draw our chalk lines, we run our straight edges, and we tell ourselves that a corpse is just an object of geometry, a collection of angles and lengths that need to be wrapped properly before the morning shift arrives to haul it away. We believe that order and routine are enough to protect our minds from the raw, ugly reality of how people in Philadelphia break apart behind closed doors. Then you pull the heavy shears across a shroud for an unnamed man, and you realize that no amount of chalk can cover up the fact that you are cutting cloth for someone who was walking around breathing just a few hours before. The heavy steel shears rested cold against my palm. I lined the lower blade up with my blue chalk mark, squeezing the handles together until the sharp metal bit deep into the heavy cotton, tearing through the warp and woof with a clean, satisfying snip. As the fabric parted, a sudden, heavy draft swept through the sub-basement from the direction of the intake corridor, carrying with it a sharp wave of freezing air that made the yellow bulb overhead swing slightly on its cord. The shadows on the stone walls danced and elongated, stretching out toward the corners of the room like long, crooked fingers reaching for the cutting table. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep pushing fabric through a sewing machine if you heard bare feet stepping out of the cold storage corridor behind your back? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. I set the shears down on the oak table, wiped the white chalk dust from my palms, and turned around to face the dark, open doorway leading out toward the morgue's main cooling vaults. The dark corridor leading from the workshop toward the main cooling vault stretched into the limestone gloom, its curved brick ceiling swallowing the amber light of my single work bulb until it dissolved into absolute shadow. I stood motionless beside the oak cutting table, my fingers resting on the edge of the newly sheared cotton shroud, listening intently to the dead silence of the sub-basement. Have you ever experienced that acute, agonizing hyper-awareness that takes over your senses when you are convinced you heard a sound in an empty room, yet your rational mind insists that nothing could possibly be moving down there? People always talk about fear as a loud, chaotic reaction, a sudden scream in the dark, a frantic dash for an exit, or a dramatic confrontation with an intruder under flashing lights. They imagine horror as something cinematic and overt, happening in broad daylight or within the comforting clutter of a furnished home. They do not know the quiet, creeping psychological erosion of working alone in a municipal basement where the only sound for hours is the rhythmic dripping of condensation from an iron pipe into a concrete drain. They do not know what it feels like when your own breathing sounds too loud, echoing off the damp stone walls like an intruder hiding just around the corner. Drip, drip, splash. A single drop of water fell from the overhead steam line into the cast iron floor drain near the corner of the room, sending a sharp, metallic ring through the stillness. I let out a slow, ragged breath, watching the faint wisp of vapor vanish into the cold air. I told myself I was losing my mind, that staying cooped up down here night after night, breathing in starched dust and disinfectant, was playing tricks on my nerves. An intake gurney arrives every few hours. It's part of the job. The orderlies drop the paperwork, slide the tray onto the lower rack, and head back up to the street level to smoke cigarettes in the alley. There was no one in the corridor. There was nothing waiting in the shadows between the cooling vaults. Think about how desperately we rely on logic and routine to talk ourselves down from the edge of panic, convincing ourselves that the strange noises and sudden drafts in an old building are entirely natural. We explain away the creaking floorboards as thermal expansion, we blame the flickering lights on aging municipal wiring, and we tell ourselves that the heavy smell of copper and rot is just the standard odor of a county morgue. We believe that rational explanations can build an impenetrable wall between our sanity and the dark things hidden beneath the city streets. Then a cold draft sweeps through a sealed room, and your carefully constructed logic shatters against the simple, terrifying certainty that you are not alone in the dark. I turned my back on the corridor, forcing myself back toward the vintage Singer sewing machine resting under the hooded lamp. The bolt of white cotton lay ready, its cut edge clean and straight where my shears had parted the fibers just moments before. My job wasn't finished. The intake card was still sitting under the skull paperweight, demanding a shroud before the morning delivery crew arrived to clear out the sub-basement racks. I pulled my wooden stool forward, planted my work boot firmly onto the heavy cast iron treadle, and reached out to guide the white linen toward the steel needle. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep moving across a sewing machine if you heard the iron treadle beneath your boot begin to rock up and down entirely on its own? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. As I pressed my foot down to start the motor, the heavy iron pedal suddenly jerked upward against my sole, pulling away from my boot with a sharp, metallic clack as the machine began to cycle through its stitches without a single drop of electricity running through the cord. The cast iron treadle beneath my work boot pumped up and down in a rigid, mechanical rhythm that defied gravity and the unplugged power cord dangling uselessly behind the wooden table. Clack, clack, clack. The vintage Singer machine was running on its own, its internal flywheel spinning with a smooth, relentless momentum while the steel needle hammered furiously up and down through the thick white cotton shroud. Have you ever experienced that complete, blood-freezing paralysis when a mechanical tool you have operated by hand for years suddenly takes on a life of its own, moving with an eerie, premeditated purpose in a silent room? People always talk about machinery as obedient instruments, cold, inanimate collections of iron, brass, and steel that remain entirely inert until a human hand flips a switch or presses a pedal. They imagine that tools are safe because they lack a will, a mind, or an agenda of their own, waiting patiently in the dark for someone to guide them through a routine task. They do not know the gut-wrenching horror of watching an unpowered machine start working in the middle of the night, driven by an invisible force that treats your tools as its own property. They do not know what it feels like when the needle starts hammering through cloth while you stand frozen, watching the fabric bunch and twist under an operator who isn't there. I tried to pull my boot back from the iron pedal, but my muscles felt locked in place, weighed down by a sudden, crushing density in the air that made every breath taste like cold iron and damp earth. Across the cutting table, the 20-yard bolt of unbleached linen began to twitch and shudder, its stiff fibers rippling as if an unseen body were shifting beneath its folds, trying to find a comfortable position under the unfinished shroud. And then I saw the thread. The white spool mounted on top of the machine was completely untouched, its cotton spool resting still and full on the pin. Instead, feeding smoothly through the upper tension discs and threading directly through the eye of the moving needle, was a thick, dark crimson thread that looked less like cotton and more like dried arterial blood. Think about how carefully we build our professional lives, wrapping ourselves in routine procedures, clean uniforms, and predictable tasks to convince ourselves that we are safe from the disorder of the world outside. We measure our materials, we stitch our seams, and we tell ourselves that everything has a proper place, a clear beginning, and a predictable end. We believe that our hands are the only ones guiding our tools, and that our workshops are secure sanctuaries away from the tragedies handled upstairs. Then a vintage sewing machine starts stitching by itself in the dark, feeding crimson thread through an unfinished burial shroud, and you realize your entire workshop is just a loom weaving a garment for someone who hasn't stopped breathing yet. The machine accelerated, the clack-clack-clack of the steel needle growing sharper and more frantic as it raced along the edge of the white cotton, tracing a complex, winding hem that didn't match any standard municipal pattern I had ever learned. It was stitching a name into the fabric, long, looping cursive letters written in the dark crimson thread, spelling out a sequence of words that ran directly along the hemline where the shroud would wrap around a man's chest. I squinted through the dim amber glare of the hooded work lamp, trying to make out the letters taking shape under the flying needle. It wasn't a standard identification number. It was a personal note, written in fine, precise stitches by an invisible hand. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep resting on a workbench if you watched a sewing machine stitch your own full name into a burial shroud using thread the color of dried blood? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. As the needle completed the final letter of the crimson script, the sewing machine abruptly ground to a halt, its flywheel spinning down with a soft, dying sigh that left the sub-basement in absolute, suffocating silence. The sudden silence of the Singer sewing machine was heavier than its noise, pressing down against my eardrums like the atmospheric drop before a violent summer storm in the streets of Philadelphia. I stood frozen beside the oak cutting table, my boots anchored to the cold concrete floor, staring down at the 20-yard bolt of unbleached white cotton stretched out beneath the hooded amber lamp. Have you ever experienced that profound, sickening vertigo when a static object begins to move on its own accord, defying every law of physics and reason while you stand helpless in an enclosed room? People always talk about inanimate objects as fixed and stable, pieces of furniture, rolls of fabric, and medical supplies that remain precisely where you left them until a human hand rearranges them. They imagine that a bolt of cloth is just dead material, waiting passively to be measured, cut, and stitched into a shape dictated by the living. They do not know the gut-wrenching horror of watching an empty shroud begin to ripple and rise from the center, as if the fabric were trying to drape itself over a body that hadn't even been brought down the elevator shaft yet. They do not know what it feels like when the linen starts to stretch and tighten, shaping itself around an invisible torso that breathes with a slow, rattling heave. The crimson thread the machine had just sewn along the hemline began to pulse with a faint, wet luminescence, glowing against the stark white cotton like a fresh scar across pale skin. Hoo, huff. A soft, congested sound rose from beneath the cloth, the unmistakable rattle of a man struggling to clear fluid from his lungs in the dark. The white cotton stretched upward, forming the sharp ridge of a chest, two raised knee joints, and the distinct outline of a human head resting on the wooden table where my yardstick and chalk had been parked just moments before. My hands hovered over the edge of the workbench, my fingers twitching with a frantic urge to run for the heavy steel exit door, but my legs felt bolted to the sub-basement floor by an invisible weight. Think about how desperately we rely on our daily routines to keep the terror of the world at arm's length, convincing ourselves that working in a morgue is just a job like any other. We measure the dead, we stitch the cloth, and we tell ourselves that once a body is wrapped, it stays still. We believe that our secure walls, our locked doors, and our professional detachment can protect us from the things that crawl out of the city's dark corners. Then an unfinished burial shroud starts breathing on your cutting table, and you realize that every garment you ever sewed was just a placeholder for someone waiting to wake up. The cloth figure shifted beneath the unbleached linen, its shoulders rolling backward with a dry, cracking sound of stiff joints moving for the first time in years. A single hand, long-fingered, pale, and stained with the blue dust of tailor's chalk, pushed up from beneath the fabric, reaching out blindly across the oak boards toward the place where I stood paralyzed. The crimson stitches along the hem began to unravel, shedding fine threads of red silk that drifted down onto the table like falling embers. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay steady if a shroud began to sit upright on your workbench and called you by your first name? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. As the white linen began to slide downward from the figure's face, revealing the hollow, sunken cheeks of a man I had buried in my nightmares 100 times before, the basement lights flickered, died, and plunged the entire room into absolute, suffocating blackness. The total darkness of the sub-basement was not empty, it was thick, heavy, and saturated with the physical presence of unbleached cotton and the sharp, chemical stench of formaldehyde rising from the floor drains. Without the amber glow of the hooded work lamp, my eyes strained against a void so absolute that even the outline of the vintage Singer sewing machine had vanished, leaving only the chilling, tactile sensation of cold iron pressing against my shins. Have you ever experienced that profound, disorienting panic when all sensory input is suddenly stripped away, leaving you entirely alone with the sound of your own frantic heartbeat echoing off damp limestone walls? People always talk about darkness as a temporary absence of light, a simple shadow that retreats the moment you flip a wall switch, open a heavy door, or strike a match. They imagine that darkness is passive, a neutral space where you can wait safely until morning restores the familiar outlines of a room. They do not know the suffocating terror of a darkness that is actively manufactured by a basement, a dark space filled with the silent, creeping movement of invisible linen slithering across the concrete floor like chilled serpents. They do not know what it feels like when the lights go out because the morgue has finished preparing your shroud. I tried to pull my boots away from the iron treadle, but the heavy cotton shroud had wound itself tightly around my ankles, binding me to the cutting table with a strength that felt less like fabric and more like iron bands. From the absolute blackness of the storage corridor, the steady dripping of the overhead condensation pipe returned, not as a soft background splash, but as a heavy, echoing thud that filled the entire subterranean room. And then, cutting through the damp silence, came a new sound. Scratch, scrape, thud. It was the unmistakable mechanical sound of a stainless steel gurney rolling across the rough concrete floor directly across the room from where I stood bound to the workbench. Think about how blindly we trust that our stories belong to us, believing that our lives are written in real time by our own choices, free from the interference of external recorders and municipal archives. We walk our streets, we do our work, and we tell ourselves that whatever happens in the dark stays buried in the past where nobody else can reach it. We believe that our private fears, our regrets, and our quiet mistakes are safely locked inside our own heads, invisible to the city around us. Then an empty gurney starts rolling in an empty basement, and you realize that every garment you ever sewed has already been measured, cut, and filed away for your own final fitting. The invisible gurney reached the edge of the oak cutting table, and through the heavy darkness of the room, a voice began to speak. It wasn't the congested rattle of the corpse from the intake chute. It was my own voice. Name, Carter, the voice recited in a calm, flat, bureaucratic monotone that I had never used in my life. Asterisk, Taylor, night shift, Philadelphia County Morgue. Shroud complete. Fitting initiated. Asterisk. I opened my mouth to scream, to deny the words, to tear myself away from the machine, but no sound came from my throat. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep stitching if you heard a voice in the dark reciting the final measurements of your own burial garment before you even lived it? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. As my own recorded voice began to describe the exact position of my hands on the workbench, the cold, blue-chalked fingers touched my neck one last time, whispering softly into the damp air. Asterisk, hold still, Carter. The seam is almost finished. Asterisk. The cold, blue-chalked fingers pressing against my neck did not release their grip. Instead, they tightened with an absolute, crushing precision, tracing the exact line where the collarbone meets the throat, exactly where a shroud's final knot is tied before the lid of the zinc box is bolted shut. My vision swam with dark spots, the absolute blackness of the unlit sub-basement bleeding outward into thick pools of bruised purple and suffocating gray. Have you ever experienced that complete, detached serenity when you realize that your body has finally stopped fighting the inevitable, and the only thing left in the world is the relentless, mechanical pull of an invisible thread drawing you toward the end of the track? People always talk about final moments as a flash of light, a hurried review of a lifetime passing before your eyes, or a desperate last effort to break free from whatever holds you down in the dark. They imagine panic pushing a person to claw at the walls, kick over heavy machinery, and scream for a rescue that never comes down the dark corridors of a municipal building. They do not know the quiet, suffocating resignation of sitting perfectly still in a limestone sub-basement while your own history is unspooled onto a damp concrete floor. They do not know what it feels like when the room stops being a workshop and turns into an endless bolt of unbleached cotton. I could feel my boots lifting clear of the floorboards. My body wasn't being dragged backward by physical muscle, it was being drawn into the horizontal plane of the oak cutting table, pulled forward by the irresistible tension of the heavy white linen and the thick crimson thread whipping wildly across the chrome needle plate. The steam pipes mounted on the stone wall above my head, pipes that had remained completely silent and cold since the winter municipal shutoff, suddenly hissed with a violent burst of pressurized vapor. Hyesis clankis. And then, louder and clearer than before, the sound of 1976 filled the entire sub-basement, heavy rain lashing against the street grates outside, a police radio crackling in an empty vehicle, and a pair of sharp steel shears scraping slowly, methodically against a wooden table. Think about how effortlessly we separate ourselves from the wreckage we handle, convincing ourselves that we are merely observers passing through a world full of broken things that other people left behind. We punch our time cards, we collect our meager municipal paychecks, and we tell ourselves that the tragedies locked inside county intake drawers are safely contained behind heavy iron doors and security codes. We believe our hands are clean because we wear chalk-stained gloves, use wooden yardsticks, and keep our distance from the blood on the linen. Then the machine pulls you into its circuit, and you realize that every shroud you ever stitched was just a blank garment waiting for your own name to be lettered on the hem. My fingers brushed against the cast iron base of the Singer machine, the cold metal biting into my skin as the final loops of crimson thread wrapped tightly around my wrists, binding my arms to the treadle like steel wire. The hooded yellow bulb overhead gave one final, violent flicker, popped with a sharp electrical spark, and plunged the entire sub-basement back into velvety, impenetrable darkness. In the pitch-black void, right against my ear, the wet, rasping voice spoke the final entry into the county ledger. Asterisk end of file, Carter. Shroud size, extra long. Asterisk. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep stitching other people's garments before the machine starts hemming your own final track? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. The air inside the pitch-black sub-basement grew instantly heavy, saturated with the metallic scent of copper, damp lime, and the unmistakable chill of a Philadelphia rainstorm seeping through the stone foundations. My own recorded voice continued to echo from the invisible corners of the room, reciting the inventory of my workbench, my chalk-stained apron, and the exact number of years I had spent hiding away in the basement of the county morgue. Have you ever experienced that dizzying, surreal terror when you realize that your entire life, every late-night shift, every yard of fabric measured, every quiet regret, is nothing more than an audio track and a pattern piece waiting to be hacked, trimmed, and unstitched by someone else? People always talk about identity as something solid and permanent, a name written on a municipal ID card, a badge pinned to a collar, or a face staring back from a cracked mirror over a bathroom sink. They imagine that who you are is entirely under your own control, shaped by your choices, your ambitions, and your own voice speaking out into the world. They do not know the gut-wrenching dread of listening to a machine replay your words before you have even finished thinking them, treating your existence as raw material for an unclaimed county file. They do not know what it feels like when your life is reduced to a length of unbleached cotton pulled backward through a bobbin case. Whir, click. The vintage sewing machine shifted gears, its high-speed reverse mechanism engaging with a sudden, mechanical shriek that tore through the damp silence. The invisible crimson thread wrapped around my forearms tightened sharply, pulling me an inch closer to the iron needle plate as the machine began to suck the fabric backward, reversing every stitch I had sewn since the shift began. Asterisk, exit, inevitable, of, edges, together, stitching, tailors, temporary, just, are. We, asterisk. The backward speech tumbled out of the darkness at double speed, sounding like a frantic, inhuman chant spoken by a dozen voices overlapping in unison inside the hollow limestone walls. Think about how carefully we curate the rhythm of our days, running our machines, drowning out the silence with the clatter of our work, and believing that we are the ones holding the foot pedal. We turn up the pace to block out the world, we change the spool when things get too heavy, and we convince ourselves that we have absolute command over the environment we inhabit. We believe that labor is fleeting, that once a garment is handed over to the drivers, it vanishes completely into the municipal cemetery. Then the machine starts pulling you backward through your own history, and you realize you aren't the tailor, you are just the cloth being unraveled until the fiber wears completely away. The freezing, chalk-stained fingers on my neck tighten their grip, sliding upward from my collar to cut my jaw with the absolute, unyielding pressure of a steel vise. A sharp flash of light, bright, blinding, and entirely blood-red, slashed across the dark basement as the destroyed work bulb miraculously sparked back to life overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the mountains of unbleached linen bolts. In the center of the room, standing right beside the empty wooden stool I had vacated hours ago, was a tall, thin silhouette dressed in an outdated municipal uniform from the 1970s, its face completely obscured by a thick, swirling cloud of white cotton dust. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep moving across the fabric before a man from an unclaimed case file steps out of the dark to take over your shift? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. The figure raised a pale, chalk-dusted hand toward the Singer machine, reached out with a non-magnetic tailor's shears, and pressed the sharp steel blades directly against the spinning thread of my life. The steel tailor's shears caught the crimson light of the flickering work bulb, gleaming with a sharp, sterile brilliance as the figure in the outdated municipal uniform held them motionless against the spinning red thread. The machine did not slow down. The cast-iron flywheel continued to blur, screaming through the cotton fibers at high speed while my own voice played backward in a distorted, mechanical loop from the dark corners of the room. Have you ever experienced that profound, paralyzing clarity when you realize that your entire existence has been trimmed down to a single, edited sequence, and you have no say over which parts get cut and which parts remain on the master roll? People always talk about life as a continuous, unfolding journey, a long road filled with unexpected turns, new beginnings, and chapters that you write for yourself day by day. They imagine that time is an open canvas, giving them the freedom to make mistakes, fix their errors, and rewrite their choices before the final curtain falls. They do not know the terrifying, claustrophobic reality of watching an editor hold a pair of shears to your history, ready to clip out your final breath and paste it into an unclaimed county file that will sit in a municipal vault forever. They do not know what it feels like when the final cut is made without your consent. The figure pressed the edge of the steel blades downward. Zzzzzzzt. A clean, violent tear ripped through the heavy cotton and the thick crimson thread. The tension snapped instantly. The iron flywheel spun out of control, flying loose from its belt and scattering long, curling lengths of unbleached linen across the damp concrete floor like spilled bandages. The roaring static of the room died in a single, heavy microsecond, replaced by an absolute, suffocating vacuum of sound. The uniform-clad figure turned its obscured face toward me, lowered the shears, and pointed them slowly at the empty cutting table resting under the dying bulb. Think about how carefully we protect our secrets, hiding our failures and our dark pasts behind locked doors, professional titles, and quiet routines, believing that as long as nobody finds the original pattern, we are safe. We sit at our workbenches, we push our pedals, and we tell ourselves that our legacy belongs to us alone. We forget that the city is a vast, automated archive that never forgets a single scream, a single dropped yard, or a single unclaimed death. Then the thread runs out, the shears come down, and you realize you were never the tailor at all, you were just a loose end waiting to be trimmed. The cold, blue-chalked fingers vanished from my jaw, leaving behind an icy numbness that spread deep into my chest. I looked down at my hands resting on the wooden workbench under the dying crimson glow of the overhead bulb. The unbleached linen was wrapping itself around my wrists again, not like a trap, but like a pair of cuffs closing for the final time. From the ceiling ventilation shaft, far above the damp streets of Philadelphia, the faint, muffled sound of an ambulance siren began to wail through the night air. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep hemming the past before someone sits down at your bench, picks up the shears, and starts cutting your own cloth? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. With a slow, mechanical click, the final stitch locked into place, the red bulb went black for good, and the workshop door locked itself from the outside. The darkness inside the sub-basement settled like wet cement, sealing every corner of the room in an absolute, suffocating silence that made the ticking of my own wristwatch sound like a heavy iron hammer striking an anvil. My wrists were bound tight to the wooden console by the curled coils of unbleached cotton and crimson thread, cold and stiff against my skin, while the heavy smell of starch and copper hung thick in the stagnant air. Have you ever experienced that strange, detached clarity when you realize that struggling against the system is entirely useless because every movement you make was already cut and measured into the master pattern years before you were born? People always talk about fighting for survival as a noble instinct, a fierce, burning determination to break free from restraints, smash open the locked doors, and claw your way back to the sunlit world outside. They imagine that willpower is enough to rewrite a tragic script, that a person can simply stand up, walk out of the dark, and reclaim their life from whatever forces are trying to pull them under. They do not know the soul-numbing reality of sitting motionless in a pitch-black room, watching the final frames of your own existence loop backward on a broken machine. They do not know what it feels like when you realize the exit door was never meant to open from the inside. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a faint red glow began to pulse from the broken work bulb hanging above my head. It wasn't the steady crimson light I had worked under for years. It flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting long, fractured shadows across the walls of the workshop where thousands of cardboard pattern boxes sat stacked from floor to ceiling. I looked down at the cutting table. The heavy steel shears lay directly in front of me, bathed in the erratic red glow. And resting right beside the sharp blades was a fresh, blank bolt of unbleached white linen, unrolling softly on its wooden core without a hand or a motor to drive it. Think about how carefully we build our daily illusions, wrapping ourselves in professional titles, routine tasks, and secure environments to convince ourselves that we are the authors of our own destiny. We lock our basement doors, we punch our time cards, and we tell ourselves that our stories are unique, protected by law, time, and distance from the dark things that happened before. We believe that our labor belongs to us, that our hands are our own, and that the city outside respects the boundaries of our private lives. Then you find yourself strapped to a workbench in an archive that nobody visits, watching a blank bolt of fabric wait for your final confession to fill its empty seams. The phantom sewing machine clicked. The invisible linen unspooled from the fresh bolt, sliding smoothly across the chrome guide pins, crossing the empty needle plate, and wrapping itself securely around the wooden core of the take-up roll. A low, subterranean hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, not the sound of the Philadelphia morgue basement, but the deep, resonant echo of a street corner in 1976, filled with the distant wail of sirens and the heavy patter of rain against asphalt. And then, my own voice emerged from the dark, speaking in a calm, flat tone that didn't belong to a living man. Asterisk, intake file 04. Subject Carter. Shroud stitching active. Asterisk. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep moving across the keys before the workshop finishes recording your chapter and files you away in the dark? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. As the blank bolt picked up speed, the cold, blue-chalked fingers returned to my shoulders, pressing down with final, unyielding weight as the machine began to hem the silence that follows the last cut. The final bolt of unbleached cotton spun in absolute silence, its coarse fibers winding smoothly onto the wooden core as the last traces of static faded from the room and the red glow of the work bulb burned down to a dull, dying ember. My hands rested flat against the wooden surface of the cutting table, completely free of the tapes and threads that had bound them, yet feeling entirely weightless, as if the bone and muscle had been replaced by thin strips of woven linen. Have you ever experienced that profound, echoing stillness that settles into a room when a story finally reaches its ultimate conclusion and the last machine clicks off for good? People always talk about endings as a form of liberation, a final curtain falling on a stage, a closed book returned to a shelf, or a locked door that separates the past from a bright, unwritten future. They imagine walking away from their work at the end of a long shift, stepping out into the cool night air, and leaving the troubles of the workplace behind in the dark. They do not know the hollow, soul-numbing reality of realizing that you were never the person operating the machine, but merely the final garment recorded onto a master bolt that cannot be unstitched. They do not know what it feels like when the archive closes its doors and you realize there is no morning shift waiting to take your place. I looked down at the vintage Singer sewing machine. The machine was completely still. The iron treadle was locked in the resting position, the balance wheel was dark, and the steel needle sat motionless in its housing. Yet, in the center of the wooden core, beneath the transparent layers of unbleached cloth, a small, perfectly typed paper label caught the dim red light of the dying bulb. It didn't bear a 1976 case number. It didn't list an unclaimed morgue arrival or an unsolved municipal incident. It bore a single name, typed in clean, professional capital letters by a machine that never makes a mistake. Carter, file closed. Think about how meticulously we arrange our lives, stacking our patterns, tidying our benches, and convincing ourselves that our daily labor is an investment in a legacy that will outlast us. We cut our cloth, we clean up the static of the world, and we tell ourselves that our names are securely written into the permanent record of the city. We forget that the archive is infinite, patient, and hungry for fresh linen. Then you stand alone in the damp basement, looking at a finished shroud with your own name on the hem, and you realize that every hour spent stitching the dead was just practice for your own final garment. I reached out my hand and touched the cold iron base of the Singer machine, feeling the faint, residual vibration of a flywheel that had finally finished its work. Outside the workshop, far up the basement stairs and past the heavy steel security doors, the distant sounds of Philadelphia began to wake up to a new dawn, car horns blaring on Broad Street, sirens wailing in the distance, and the relentless, mechanical heartbeat of a city that never stops measuring. I pulled my fingers back, stepped away from the oak table, and turned toward the dark hallway. The heavy steel door swung open on its own, revealing a long, empty corridor stretching endlessly into the white fluorescent light of the morning. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep writing your story before the workshop finishes your bolt and files you away in the dark? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. The long, empty corridor stretched ahead of me in the harsh white fluorescent light, its clean, sterile glare a sharp contrast to the damp, amber-lit limestone gloom of the sub-basement workshop I had left behind. My boots clicked against the freshly waxed linoleum floor, a sharp, crisp sound that echoed off the white-tiled walls of the upper municipal corridor. Have you ever experienced that dizzying, dreamlike disorientation when you step out of a confined, underground space where you have spent years working in isolation, only to discover that the world above hasn't changed at all while your entire reality collapsed? People always talk about escaping a dark place as a moment of pure triumph, a triumphant surge of adrenaline as you burst through the doors, gulping down fresh air and running toward the freedom of the open city. They imagine sunlight warming your face, birds singing in the trees, and the comforting knowledge that you have finally left your nightmares locked safely behind you in the dark. They do not know the hollow, unsettling reality of walking out into a hallway that looks entirely ordinary, yet feels completely foreign, as if you are moving through a stage set built by strangers who expect you to play a part you never rehearsed. They do not know what it feels like when the doors open themselves, inviting you upward into a building that is waiting for your return. I kept walking, my hands stuffed deep into the pockets of my canvas jacket, feeling the fine, chalk dust residue coating my palms. On either side of the hallway, heavy wooden doors stood closed, their brass nameplates catching the fluorescent glare. County Coroner, Records and Intake. Pathology, Suite B. Municipal Administration, Archives. Everything was quiet. The morning staff hadn't arrived yet. The early shift workers were still out on Broad Street drinking coffee from paper cups or driving their cabs through the lingering Philadelphia fog. Yet, as I passed the open doorway of the main administrative office, something caught my eye on the large oak sorting desk near the center of the room. Think about how carefully we build our defenses against the past, convincing ourselves that physical distance and locked doors are enough to keep our ghosts from following us into the light of day. We walk up the stairs, we leave the basement behind, and we tell ourselves that whatever happened down in the shadows belongs to the night, powerless against the bright, bureaucratic routine of a new morning. We believe that a change of scenery is enough to reset the narrative, turning the page to a clean, unblemished chapter where our mistakes can no longer find us. Then you spot your own name written in bold, grease pencil letters across a stack of fresh administrative forms sitting on a supervisor's desk, and you realize the building itself is just an extension of the archive. I stopped in the doorway, my boots planted firmly on the linoleum, and stared at the desk. Resting squarely on top of the paperwork was a pair of heavy steel tailor's shears, their blades smeared with faint traces of dried crimson thread. Beside them lay a single roll of unbleached white cotton, freshly cut and folded with exact, geometric precision. And pinned right to the center of the fabric was an official municipal employment card bearing my photograph, my date of birth, and a new title typed across the bottom line, Night Shift Supervisor, Permanent Assignment. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep scrolling through your daily plans before you notice that someone else has already scheduled your next destination? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. As I reached out my hand toward the desk, the heavy administrative door clicked shut behind me with a solid, definitive snap, locking from the inside. ## Chapter 14, The Final Needle and the Empty Room. The heavy steel administrative door clicked shut behind me with a solid, definitive snap, its brass latch engaging with a sound that echoed down the empty municipal hallway like the drop of an iron gavel. I didn't turn the handle. I didn't reach out to rattle the brass knob or test the lock. I stood motionless beside the oak sorting desk under the hum of the fluorescent sealing tubes, staring down at the municipal employment card pinned to the center of the folded white cotton shroud. Have you ever experienced that complete, profound realization that no matter how many chapters you write, how many layers of story you build, or how far up the stairs you run to escape the basement, the narrative was finished before you ever picked up the pen? People always talk about the final chapter as a grand finale, a moment of ultimate resolution where all the loose threads are tied together, the protagonist achieves their goal, and the book closes with a satisfying sense of completion. They imagine walking away into the sunset, leaving the dark rooms, the sewing machines, and the cold intake ledgers far behind in the past. They do not know the quiet, inescapable truth of realizing that an archive doesn't let its workers retire, it simply promotes them to a permanent position within the walls. They do not know what it feels like when the story you thought you were telling turns out to be the story that was writing you all along. I reached out my hand and touched the cold steel blades of the tailor's shears resting beside the unbleached cotton. The metal was freezing, not with the ambient chill of an air-conditioned room, but with the deep, foundational cold of limestone foundations buried 40 feet beneath the streets of Philadelphia. The fluorescent light overhead flickered once, hummed loudly, and settled into a steady, unblinking glare. Outside the high frosted windows of the administrative office, the distant sounds of Broad Street, the car horns, the early morning sirens, the low rumble of municipal buses, began to fade, replaced by a deep, absolute silence that rolled up the stairwells and swallowed the building whole. Think about how meticulously we construct our lives, convincing ourselves that our choices are our own, that our labor has meaning, and that our names are written in ink that won't fade when the shift is over. We measure our days, we cut our cloth, we stitch our words together into long, multi-chapter designs, and we tell ourselves we are safe behind our locked doors and our secure routines. We forget that every story is just a temporary garment waiting to be folded, packed, and filed away on a shelf that never sees the light of day. Then you stand alone in the quiet office, looking at your own permanent assignment typed on a municipal card, and you realize that the machine was never outside of you, it was running inside your chest the entire time. I picked up the shears. The metal fit into the palm of my hand with an absolute, familiar perfection, as if my fingers had been molded around the handles before I was ever born. Across the room, against the far wall of the office, a door I had never noticed before slowly swung open on silent brass hinges, revealing a long, narrow workshop illuminated by a single hooded yellow bulb hanging over a vintage Singer sewing machine. The iron treadle was rocking back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm, waiting for someone to sit down and finish the last seam. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep moving across your keyboard before the archive closes your file and turns off the light? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. I walked across the linoleum floor, stepped through the open doorway into the warm amber glow of the sub-basement, and pulled my chair up to the machine.